Hello everyone, welcome back to another one of our Disney Bible studies. We're going to be discussing today the old-time classic Disney film known as Cinderella. Now, for those of you who are familiar with the Disney grade film, you had themes like the fairy godmother, you had the mice, you had all of the individual characters. Until the strike of 12, you must come back or everything's going to be undone. But nothing could be further from the truth, noting that pretty much every modem of entertainment has been a parody of an older story, and the only story that's ever been worth telling in history has been the one from the greatest story ever told, when God interacted with mankind. There's a lot of things that we could talk about in direct parallels to Scripture regarding Cinderella that I'd love to bring up with you and just have the opportunity to discuss the illustrations and really just shine a light and give new appreciation for these things. But today we're going to be talking not necessarily about the Disney film as much as the original story, before we get into the original story that these were based on. So, getting into the overarching theme, the first passage that I want to read to you guys is found in 1 Samuel 16, verses 6 through 12. For those of you who are familiar with Old Testament passages, especially concerning the life of David, you would know that this is an important one regarding God's heart and perspective. Now, this is, in a sense, Cinderella's plotline in a nutshell, both Disney and the old-time short story. So if you could read this along with me, once again, 1 Samuel 16 and verse 6. So it was when they came that he looked at Eliab and said, "Surely the Lord's anointed is before him." But the Lord said to Samuel, "Do not look at his appearance or at his physical stature, because I have refused him. For the Lord does not see as man sees, for man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart." So Jesse called Abinadab and made him pass before Samuel. And he said, "Neither has the Lord chosen this one." Then Jesse made Shammah pass by, and he said, "Neither has the Lord chosen this one." Thus Jesse made 7 of his sons pass before Samuel. And Samuel said to Jesse, "The Lord has not chosen these." And Samuel said to Jesse, "Are all the young men here?" And he said, "There remains yet the youngest, and there he is keeping the sheep." And Samuel said to Jesse, "Send and bring him, for we will not sit down until he comes here." So he sent and brought him in. Now he was ruddy, with bright eyes, and good looking. And the Lord said, "Arise, anoint him, for this is the one." The slipper fit right when David was brought before Samuel. A little bit of context as far as the biblical passage before we get into the original story that is going to bring this topic up and shine light upon it for those of you who aren't familiar. Samuel was the last of the judges of Israel. In Israel's earlier history, they went through times cyclically, essentially, in their relationship with God, where they would follow God, sort of become complacent, fall away from him, do their own things, serve idols, get overtaken by their enemies, and then they'd realize that what they were doing was stupid, turn back to God. God would rise up a special judge, a figure of authority, to fight off their enemies. They would live in prosperity, and this happened 7 times over and over again in what is called the Book of Judges. And 1 Samuel is what we would call the transition from the time of the judges to the time of the kings. And for those of you guys who know Israeli history, the first king of Israel was a guy by the name of Saul. And Saul was an okay guy, but being a human leader, eventually fell into corruption, made his own mistakes, and ended up just a screaming wreck of a mess by the end of his life. So God, when he had made his mistakes and ultimately had rejected his relationship with God, kind of part of the resume if you're going to be a king of God's people, God said, "I want you, Samuel, to go and bring me another king." So he said, "Go to the town of Jesse, and I'll tell you which son I will choose for you to anoint as the next king of Israel." It's essentially going to be called, as a child, to be Saul's successor. So Samuel goes to the town of Jesse, which was known as Bethlehem. No short of significance there. But when he has all these kids pass before him, they're all good looking, they're all promising, the same qualifications that made Saul such an appealing choice for Israel as far as being their king. But God said no, because their heart is what matters. Their character is what I'm looking for. I want a leader that's actually going to follow me, that's going to honor me, that will be an example to the people of me and my heart. So when all of the good looking boys passed by, Jesse thought the last person to consider was David, and eventually, when David's name got brought up mysteriously, they said, well, bring him out here. And the moment that Samuel saw him, God said, that's the one. That's the man who's going to be after my own heart. And thus he was chosen to be the next king. Well, the plot overview for Cinderella is fairly straightforward in its comparison to this story, but I want to focus on a story that's actually a little bit more biblically relevant so that we can gain an appreciation not only for the older story, but also the original story in light of 1 Samuel. The original story, Cinderella, was written by two men. Their names were Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm, and these boys were known as the Grimm brothers, very famous authors that were well known for a number of their short stories. And all of their work, save for, well, I can't even name a few, they had a lot of biblical inspiration, just well and apparent in the overarching themes of what their writings and what their stories were all about. The story begins with Cinderella's mother, who was dying, and on her deathbed she told her daughter, "Dear child, remain pious and good, then our dear God will always protect you, and I will look down on you from heaven and be near you." Well, it's not hard to see the biblical parallels in that, but noting that these are direct quotes from the book, I highly recommend that you read the story on your own time. It's barely 3 pages. You can get through it, even in today's culture. It comes in Kindle. You can read it on your mobile device. But noting all of these things, the story pretty much progresses with this being the overarching theme. The father gets over the death of his wife, even though Cinderella spent all of her time weeping on the grave of her mother. And when he remarries, 2 new stepsisters come in along with the deal, and the book literally says they had pretty faces but evil hearts, and made Cinderella do all the dirty work and only fed her with lentils, these little protein beans essentially, that they found thrown into the fire from the ashes. Now this was taken directly from Isaiah 61, and I'll read verses 1 through 3 to you. "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me to preach tidings to the poor. He has sent me to heal the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives, and opening of the prison to those who are bound, to proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord, the day of vengeance of our God, to comfort all those who mourn." Now here's where we get into it. "To comfort those who mourn, console those who mourn in Zion, to give them beauty for ashes, to give them joy for mourning, the garment of praise for the spirit of heaviness, that they may be called trees of righteousness, planting of the Lord, that he may be glorified." And this passage was actually directly read by Jesus in the Gospel of Luke. If you want to take a closer look at that, we'll be discussing it in our Through the Bible series in time. But as well, we've actually discussed the parallels of this on multiple occasions in our Star Wars Bible studies, and I would gladly defer you to them if you want to understand the prophetic implications of how Jesus fulfilled this in a specific way and format regarding his first and second comings, and how he's going to fulfill it in his second. But that point being made aside, the terms beauty for ashes, joy for mourning, what state is Cinderella in? She's in a state of grief and loss for her mother. But as we know where the story ends in both scenarios, Disney stayed true to that as much, that their grief is going to be replaced with celebration, that their loss is going to result in them being blessed even more, that they would have beauty in exchange for ashes. And even though she's feeding scraps, one day she would eat at the banquet of a king. So, noting this as part of Cinderella's character, that she remained humble and pure, as the brothers Grimm directly mentioned her being. And when the girls asked their father, when he would be going out of town to a festival and come back, he said, "What shall I bring you girls as far as gifts?" They asked for dresses, and the other asked for jewels. But Cinderella asked for something different that directly ties into this passage. She asked for the first twig that touches her father's hat. If it breaks off, I want you to go back and get it, and I want you to bring it back to me. And when he does so, she plants this twig at her mother's grave, and she prays before it, asking for it to bless her. Once again, not too hard to see the parallels. And you can also note this was actually an olive branch that the branch that Moses, or no, not Moses, different guy involving water, that Noah was brought back by, a bird, when he found out that the waters were beginning to recede and that life was going to be restored, that even though a time of trouble had come on the earth, and greatly so with the flood, that when he released a raven the first time, it went off feasting on the people's bodies that were floating on the surface, the carrion bird. Then he released a dove, and the dove found no place to rest, and it never came back. But when he sent it out the second, the third time, eventually it came back with an olive branch, and this was a sign of hope, a promise of hope for the future, that God wasn't done with mankind just yet. And this being the case as well, as this tree would continue to grow, instead of the mice being Cinderella's friends in the attic, the story actually goes that the birds that would then perch on this little olive branch would actually become Cinderella's friends. And this was the implication as far as the animals being her support. Now, when a festival came to town regarding a royal banquet where the girls would be able to go dancing and dressing up and such, the sisters and the wicked stepmother made fun of her and said that she could go if she was only able to find all of the lentils and the ashes and to separate them, all the things that were good from all the things that were useless and burnt up. So what does she do? She asks for the birds, the tamed birds that she had made friends with, to come and help her to go through and sort out the seeds and the things that are useless and take all the lentils and put them in a separate pile. Now, this tree had now grown into what was actually a hazelnut tree, not an olive one. But when she had managed to finally do this, the birds had helped her to accomplish it, to, just like we saw in the Disney film, sew up this nice little dress together. The stepsisters, tore it to pieces. Oh, this is useless, so you can't be used. Well, they went back on their deal in the original story as well. And obviously, being in a time of grief, remember this is when the fairy godmother showed up. But noting that the brothers Grimm stuck a lot more to a biblical parallel and making my job easier as well as for yours to recognize this, she didn't turn to a fairy godmother. Or rather, the fairy godmother didn't come to her. What she did was she went at the foot of this hazelnut tree and she said some very interesting words. "Throw down gold and silver to me." Now, noting that this was a very interesting request to make, the poetry and the format in which Cinderella was told would imply there was a lot more of a sing-song tone to this. But when the sisters had rejected her, she had separated all the ashes from the lentils. Just an obvious joke on her part. What was being pointed to here? She said, "O hazelnut tree, please throw down silver and gold for me." And why did she do that? Why was she talking to a tree? Is this an idol? No. What she's doing is remembering her mother's promise. She's saying, "Always remain pious and good. I will be there to look down to heaven and to help you." Knowing that God would always be there, this reminder and promise from her mother that God's blessings would always be on her life when she was put in a difficult situation, when doors were shut in her face to be able to enjoy life. She turned to God. She prayed at the foot of the hazelnut tree, not to the tree, not to the birds, but to God, to give her a blessing that she needed. And this ties well into 1 Kings chapter 17. And I'll be reading verse 5. "So he went and did according to the word of the Lord, for he went and stayed at the brook Cherith, which flows into the Jordan. And ravens brought him bread and meat in the morning, and bread and the meat in the evening, and he drank from the brook." Now, who is this he? This is the prophet Elijah. And this is actually immediately following after he had his little run-in with the prophets of Baal. And after calling down fire on the altar, it was totally an awesome scene. He'd prayed, and it didn't rain for 3.5 years. And when Israel was at the verge of this point of drought, Elisha basically just turned to the congregation of Israel and said, "Is Baal Lord? Serve him. If God is God, worship him. But choose this day whom you will serve. God, I know you're the true and living God, but for the sake of these people and for your great name, please call down fire on this altar." And he not only burned up the altar, the wood of the sacrifice, but he even melted the rocks to prove to Israel through miraculous means that he was still in charge, that he was still God and Baal was false. The prophets of Baal were cutting themselves and going into this demonic shrieking frenzy to get his attention, and nothing happened. And that's the point. But when Jezebel, the pagan queen and wife of King Ahab, who was king of Israel at the time, had introduced this Baal worship. When she found out all of her posse had been wiped out and proven wrong, she doesn't repent. She says, I'm going to kill you, Elijah. So he goes into hiding, and God provides for him. He has this door shut in his face, and what happens? God sends birds to provide for his needs. The dress that the birds brought Cinderella when she prayed for it was a dress of pure gold. It wasn't all white and frilly like you saw in the movie. It was a golden dress, golden slippers, golden gloves, everything. And when she went to the festival, no one recognized her, but everyone wanted to dance with her. And even though her stepsisters said that she would just be an embarrassment, the prince himself said, I want to dance with her for all 3 days of the festival. But as well, in the story, it's actually kind of fun. When the prince goes to walk her to her home, she obviously needs to get there fast before her stepmother and stepsisters find out that she's been gone. So she, the first time, goes hiding into a pigeon coop and manages to slip out and run her way home, get the dress off, throws it to the bird takes it back up to heaven, and then she just sits there and weeps silently at her grave like she's known to do by her family. So when the stepsisters, come home from the dress and they're like, oh, there's Cinderella, guess that's where she's been all night because that's all she ever does. They were none the wiser. The prince had them chop up the pigeon coop, but she wasn't in it, so she got away that time. The second time was fun. She climbed up a pear tree, managed to jump down on the other side. The prince said, cut down the pear tree. She wasn't there. But then the third time he had kind of taken a hint, and he said, well, instead, when she decides to make her run, I'm going to lay some tar and pitch on one of the steps in which she's going to be running down so that when she runs, her slipper stays behind. And she did. When she made a step, one of her slippers fell off, but when she had made it home anyway, no one was the wiser. So the prince goes around and asks people, have you seen the girl who owns this golden shoe? Because I want to marry her. Starting to see more and more parallels here, aren't you? Well, the stepsisters, not wanting to miss out on this opportunity to be royalty, tried to put on the shoe. And you remember, as it was shown in the movie, see a perfect fit, and it's all scrunched up like a sponge. Well, in the brothers Grimm stories, they were a little bit more morbid in their methodology in trying to represent this. The big sisters wanted so badly to become princesses and royalty, and the stepmother said, well, if the shoe doesn't fit, then cut off your big toe. I mean, you won't need to walk anyway anymore if you're royalty, so why not sacrifice a part of your body to make yourself fit into a lie? Well, when the shoes fit, they almost got away with it and thought they would become queen, but then the birds from Cinderella's tree started singing a song. Rook-de-goo, rook-de-goo. There's blood in the shoe. The shoe is too tight. This bride is not right. And I'm directly quoting the book there. Now, going back to 1 Samuel, what happened? The most attractive, the most seemingly good people were rejected. The older sister, the younger sister, they had the right image, but the wrong attitude. And what was God looking for? He was looking for someone with the right heart to lead his people, to become king. And what was this prince looking for? To become his queen? Saying, I want the girl who fits this shoe just right. And the girls, they tried, but ultimately what happened? It was a fake, it was a lie. Even though the shoe fit, the reality hadn't changed. The truth couldn't be hidden. And what did the birds say? Rook-de-goo, rook-de-goo, there's blood in the shoe is too tight, the bride is not right. But then what happened? When the most appealing of the girls were rejected, the man asked, is there any other girl in the home? Just like Samuel asked, is this all the sons that you have? And what happened? Well, Cinderella came out, but she's just, always crying at her mother's grave. She's covered in ashes and lentils. You don't want anything to do with her. She doesn't look like a queen. Oh. Well, what happened when she put on the shoe? The birds sang a different song. Rook-de-goo, rook-de-goo. I don't know if this is how pigeons sound, but apparently. No blood's in the shoe. The shoe's not too tight. This bride is right. So lastly, when Cinderella was made queen, and the girls, the sisters, the stepsisters, the wicked stepsisters of Cinderella tried to attend the wedding and become the bridesmaids to kind of gain from her favor. I mean, despite the fact that they had mauled their feet and they could barely make the journey as it was, when they tried to attend the wedding, what happens? Well, Cinderella's birds plucked their eyes out. Yeah, a little bit different from the Disney movie, but I appreciate the symbolism as being a little bit more obvious than the fairy godmother. But the truth and the symbolism remains the same, because what? They refused to see the truth of who they were. That Cinderella had a beauty that they never could. And because they wouldn't see it, they'd never see again. Now note, is this the fate for all people who just are corrupt in attitude and character? No, people can change, people can grow, but people who refuse to will face the consequences. And noting that this whole story is a far sight more different than the fairy godmothers and the mice that you're probably used to, I want you guys to tie back to understand the message. Cinderella was beautiful even when no one was looking at her. And that's what made this story significant. The stepsisters deceived people into thinking that they were beautiful when who they were as people made their appearances a lie. Cinderella's mother gave her daughter something the wicked stepmother never gave to her daughters. Make God your focus and your heart more important than your body. Just like that tree, when it was fully grown, the birds won't be there to condemn you, but rather be there to confirm the reality that God has always been ready and willing to bless you. Let me read that passage one more time. 1 Samuel chapter 1 and verse 7. Man looks at the outward appearance, but God looks at the heart. That's the message of Cinderella. That's the story. That's its purpose. And I hope, if anything else, that through the Bible it's not only given you a further appreciation of the Disney film, but maybe another excuse to read this passage more intently. Because the book of 1 Samuel is full of lessons, not any less significant than this one, but a very important lesson indeed. Thank you for your time in listening to this study. If you have questions or would like to know more about the Brothers Grimm, perhaps where to find the collections of their stories, or other themes that you've seen in their books that perhaps haven't been parodized by Disney, or perhaps even symbols in the movie itself that you'd like addressed, I'll be happy to address them in the comments below. If you'd like to encourage the ministry, you know where to go. But most importantly, if you know someone who perhaps has seen these movies or read these stories, but probably hasn't taken the time to understand the significance of them, please share this study with anyone and everyone that you feel will be blessed by it. Thank you for your time in listening to this study, and remember, Jesus loves you, and He knows your heart, and He wants to grow in it too, and He will if you let Him.